Great, thank you everyone for sticking with us. Last up is Martina Kirchberger. Do you want to share your slides, Martina? Great, and take it away, and the normal timings apply.
Thanks everyone, particularly for being here still on a Friday, wherever time zone you are, and thanks very much for including this paper in the program here. This is joint work with Cecile and Bern, who is in the audience and happy to answer questions in the chat or also in the discussion afterwards. So there's this recent literature that highlights the importance of key sectors that are crucial and might affect the productive efficiency of economies and lead to bottlenecks in that. What we're interested in this paper is the role of intermediate goods in the construction sector. Now, investment consists of equipment and machinery and construction. I'm going to show you some data that the construction sector accounts for about half of investment on average in the data. So it's a sizable share of investment. And I think we think a lot more about equipment and machinery, that component of investment typically. So what we paying particular importance to or attention to in this paper is a key intermediate input in construction, which is cement. It's a core ingredient of concrete. There are few substitutes. It's used abundantly. So concrete is the second most used resource in the world after water. It's a homogeneous good, so we don't have to think too much here about quality differences, and it's largely non-traded. So at a global level, it's only about 5% of cement that is traded. That's not to say that for some countries it's an important import, but at a global level on aggregate, it's you can think about it largely as a non-tradable. So just to clarify here, this is what we're talking about, this gray powder. Once you mix that with sand, water and aggregates, you get concrete, and then this is ready mixed concrete. These two are very different in terms of the perishability. You can see they perish very quickly, whereas cement is what we're going to talk most about. It's an industry that's characterized by significant market power, and that's the case across the whole world, and it's been documented extensively. We also know from anecdotes that some of the development world's greatest fortunes appear to be based on profits from the cement industry. So for example, the richest person in Africa owns a cement plant. Another of the billionaires in Africa is his competitor in the country. So we have these anecdotes here of large profits to be made in the industry. So what do we do in this paper? We start by using the confidential microdata of the ICP. I'll talk a lot more about that on intermediate inputs, so documenting prices. We collect and hand code current and historical data on market structure of the cement industry. And so we start by documenting 3 motivating facts at a global level. So first, I'm going to show you data on price dispersion of precisely defined key construction sector intermediate inputs. Second, we're going to look at market power in the cement industry. And third, I'm going to show you some data on the role of construction in capital formation and the role of cement in construction sector expenditures. In the second part of the paper, we're going to use an oligopoly model to examine the role of market power in cement as a particular type of distortion in the sector producing investment. And in the final part, I'll show you a simple model of capital accumulation to examine the effects of changes in market structure on the steady state capital stock. So how much does this matter for capital stock in the steady state? What we're going to find is that there's large spatial price dispersion of these key construction sector intermediate inputs. And we're going to see that there are particularly large differences in the price of cement. There's a strong bivariate relationship between market power and prices. So countries that have fewer firms or higher concentration have higher prices. And also that cement plays a significant role in construction sector expenditures. And that varies a lot across countries. I'm sure most of you are thinking now, how can this matter in terms of expenditure shares? But I'll show you for some countries, cement accounts for a non-negligible share of construction sector expenditures. Now, second, we're going to show that market power in the cement industry leads to significantly higher prices. I'm also going to show you some plant level data that this doesn't appear to be due to low scale. So that's something that we need to worry about. It has a very different policy implication from one where we think there's some barriers to entry potentially. And we're also going to use data from WorldScope on profits of firms to show you that profits are substantial in this sector. The quantification exercise is going to illustrate that the statistic capital stock in the poorest countries is most sensitive to these changes in markups in cement. So again, these effects are really significant in some countries. They don't matter in a lot of other countries where the expenditure shares are small and the industry is fairly competitive. Now, why is the construction sector important? Well, physical structures are required as an input into almost any activity we can think of. So it's buildings for firms, individuals, and government, core infrastructure, roads, bridges, harbors to transport goods and people. I was thinking of the banner that was used for this conference. It's a classical example of all the different pieces that are being produced by the construction sector, whether it was the containers, what's being produced in the containers, the infrastructure of the ports, the infrastructure in cities, buildings, and as well for power generation. So nuclear plants and dams. Dams are an example that you need concrete for to build. There's just no other way. And there are certain types of infrastructure where there is just no substitute. For different types, you can substitute between steel to some extent, and there are certain pieces that are not substitutable really. Now, there's evidence that the cost of physical investment is high in low-income countries. The component of investment that's equipment and machinery that can be imported, and that's been studied fairly extensively. There are frictions there too, but that's less the case for construction sector goods. So there's a direct link between domestic industry structure in construction and investment prices. Now, we relate to a number of literatures. So we relate to the literature on the cost of capital, input-output linkages in production networks, as we just saw in the talk two before, the role of firm-level markups in general equilibrium, and the literature on misallocation in developing countries. So you'll see, while we take bits and pieces in our model, the main contribution I think that we make to this literature is that we use new microdata on key intermediate inputs in construction to understand distortions in the specific sector that's key for investment. We also relate to this literature on cement and ready-mix concrete that's typically using US data. And our contribution here is that we study the industry at a global level. We have a different focus. So we're really interested in the macroeconomic consequences of markups and what we can say about implications for countries at different income levels. Okay, so I'm going to start by showing you the data and our motivating facts, and talk about market power, and then the general equilibrium model. Now, the main data that we use come from the microdata of the World Bank's International Comparison Project, and we use the 2011 and the 2017 data that have just become available recently. In 2011, the ICP had a major overhaul of their construction sector PPP and how that's being computed. And they dropped an output-based approach to move to an input-based approach. And so the first part here, we spend a lot of time thinking about measurement. And we choose our core key intermediate input list based on two criteria. One, it's an input that's used globally. And the ICP data has wide coverage across countries. And so the core inputs that we look at in the paper is concrete and its constituents, main constituents, cement, sand, and aggregates, and then bricks, wood, and two types of steel. These are mild steel reinforcement and steel beams. Today, I'm going to talk about the first four. In the paper, we discuss price dispersion in all of them. So it's key for this type of paper where we're really concerned about measurement that we talk about who is the buyer. So all prices represent prices paid by builders, the quantity. So it's very different when we talk about a bag of cement versus a ton, and the quality. And this is all specified by the ICP. So for example, here, the ICP in the case of concrete would specify that it's a cubic meter of concrete mixed at certain proportions with a characteristic strength of here that's 20 Newton. And so this is a typical type of concrete for buildings. It doesn't rule out that there's heterogeneity in quality, but it's crucially important. Without that, we couldn't do this kind of measure. It's an important step in being able to measure price differences, to hold quantity and quality to a large extent constant. A big caveat of our paper is that we have one price per country, and that's sort of what we gain in being able to do this at a global level. We lose by having within country price dispersion that some of the other papers that focus on the literature in one country are able to do in much more detail. I'm going to start by showing you the differences in the 2011 prices. So here, these are the averages for the different regions. The first column shows you concrete, then cement, aggregates, and then sand. And so what you can see when you look at concrete prices, the highest prices are in the last row, that's Sub-Saharan Africa. Second highest prices are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there are large differences when we compare, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa with North America, but even larger when we look at East Asia and Pacific or South Asia. Now, when we look at the constituents of concrete, so cement, aggregate, and sand, it's really cement that is driving these differences. So a ton of cement here costs about $260 in Sub-Saharan Africa compared to $189 in North America. Now, there are differences in the price of aggregates, but these patterns are not the same as they're in cement. And then sand is fairly cheap in Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific. It's only North America where prices are actually higher. And if we have time later or there's interest, I'm happy to go into the other input prices. But these are the key motivating difference that we see in the prices that we're going to study in the paper. So the overall observations is that there's large heterogeneity in input prices. The heterogeneity is even larger when we use PPPs, so relative price ratios are often larger than 3. It's an interesting sort of side note that the aggregate construction sector PPPs mask these differences that we see in the input prices, partially because wages are much lower. We don't know how they're precisely computed to be able to replicate this, but it's just interesting that we would not see this in the aggregate sector level PPPs. Cement prices are particularly high in Africa. The differences are somewhat lower in 2017, but they're still there. And in light of cement's importance globally, we focus on cement for the rest of the paper as an example for an important intermediate input in capital. Okay, so let's look at some of these prices in more detail. So that's the price of ton of cement in the 10 most expensive countries in the world compared to the US. And so you can see that these differences are much larger than what we saw in the averages. So in the Central African Republic, a ton costs $487 compared to $139 in the US. Most of these countries are in Sub-Saharan Africa. When we look at them, probably we can already think about different explanations for these varying reasons why cement might be high in these locations. But it's clear that it's the countries with the lowest levels of capital here that are facing the highest prices. Now, why is cement so expensive in these countries? Now, there's several possible explanations, and it's an untradeable, if we believe it's an untradeable good, or we take that at face value, it's not, we wouldn't expect it to cost the same, but there's a question why there are these huge price differences. So one explanation that has been discussed sort of in policy circles is there's a lack of competition. An alternative explanation is that costs are high to produce cement, and therefore it costs more. A third alternative competing explanation is that demand is low. So these plants have to operate below minimum efficient scale, or there could be other factors, we call them frictions, rule of law, corruption, political instability that just increases the cost of producing. So what I'm going to show you next is data on the market structure of the global cement industry. What we're going to do is in the empirical section, we're going to try to control for input costs, scale, and other frictions. So measures for corruption, rule of law, and political instability. We're going to look at plant distributions to see whether there's evidence that plants are substantially smaller, and then world scope data to look at profits, which would give us to some extent, a little bit of an insight on to what extent productivity differences might be driving this, although that's not something that we can say very much about. Okay, so let's look at the global cement industry. Now, the way we measure this is that we've collected data on the global distribution of cement plants and ownership of groups. So a group is what we're going to call a firm across 180 countries. And we have these data for 2011 and 2018, and we got them, we extracted them from the Global Cement Report. So for each country, this report contains a chapter on production, consumption, and the market structure of the cement industry. And there's a little table that says these are the firms, these are the number of plants. And so the way we define the number of firms per country is that we use the group name if it's provided, or otherwise the company name. So if a plant is owned by a company and that's owned, for example, by LafargeHolcim, one of the largest producers, that will be the firm in that country. So this is how we define number of firms per country, because that's what we think, this is the level at which prices are going to be set strategically. We also compute alternative measures. So we have also geocoded all the plants in 2018. And so using the spatial location of firms, we compute, I'll talk a lot more about it, we compute alternative measures of markets using something more local. And we look at the Herfindahl-Hirschman index here, where we have, where we use S for S, we use the capacity of firms that we also have in the database for 2018. So that's two alternative measures. Now, the industry is overall characterized by high market power. So 40% of countries have a firm that provides more than 50% of the country's total cement capacity in 2011. So for example, in Mexico, and this is not an African phenomenon, so this is a Mexican example, 3 of the 6 groups in the country, these 3 groups, account for more than 3/4 of Mexico's cement capacity. And this is in 2011, in 2017, it's even higher. Now, when you think back of the list of the 10 most expensive countries in 2011, 7 of these countries had 1 firm, 2 countries had no firms, and 1 country had 3 firms. Now, these are the, this is just bivariate relationships. So that's a local polynomial regression of the price per ton of cement against deciles of the number of firms in 2011. And on the right, the plot on the right shows you the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And so in a sort of very descriptive, we're not controlling for anything here, this is nothing causal, you can see that whenever the number of firms is higher, prices are lower, and whenever markets are more concentrated, prices are higher. These patterns are very similar for 2017. Okay, so just to talk about cement and how much this matters in overall expenditures, this uses data from the ICP and on cement consumption. The left graph shows you the share of construction in investment, and this is this figure that I cited before. It's on average 50% of investment is the construction sector's contribution. So it's an important part to be thinking about when we think about capital formation. The graph on the right shows you cement expenditure as a share of total construction expenditures. And so you can see here that cement accounts for a non-negligible share of the construction sector. The median is 0.08, so that's fairly small, and we would expect in a country where cement prices are low that share not to be high. But there is a 75th percentile where it accounts for more than 17% of total construction sector expenditure. So for some countries, this is an important expenditure item in their construction sector expenditures, and that's something that will be reflected in the quantification exercise as well. Now, this is expenditure shares, just a little bit more looking at which are the countries which have large expenditure shares. So the left plots expenditure shares, cement share of construction expenditures by GDP per capita, and then in the right, we plotted against log cement prices. And you can see that these shares are large for sub-Saharan African countries. We're highlighting these in red. And there's this positive relationship between expenditure shares and prices. Okay, so these motivating facts show that there's large price dispersion in key construction sector inputs. Cement prices are 35% higher in sub-Saharan Africa than, for example, in North America. Market power is positively correlated with prices, and cement share in construction is non-negligible, and it's highest in the poorest countries. So maybe that's a good moment to stop and see whether there are any questions.
Jagdish, let me go and promote you to a panelist, and you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. My one question was, I think of construction as maybe very cyclical. I was wondering whether it's more volatile or more cyclic in some countries, so that then if I look during a boom period, I'll see more profits. But if I average over time, maybe it's less difference across countries.
Yeah, it's certainly an industry with a lot of cyclicality. One drawback, in addition to the lack of spatial variation in prices, is that we don't have a whole lot of temporal variation. We could look a little bit more on the profits and the firm level data on this, but unfortunately we only have prices and market structure here at these 2 points. But for the sector overall, that's certainly important.
I had a question. I think of cement as non-tradable, so then I thought it might be more relevant to compare the price to either the other goods in the economy more generally, or things that they use cement to make and sell. But I think that would reinforce your finding, because those prices tend to be lower in developing countries and higher in rich countries.
Yeah, in a way, I think the PPP comparison should capture that to some extent, I would think. But we can certainly compare it as well with other, I think also with other goods. I think the price differences would be even starker there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Great.
Pedro Bento.
Sorry, maybe I should defer this till later. So you're not going to, in your framework, you're not going to, are you going to be thinking about entry as being endogenous in some way?
Yeah, we are.
You said something about demand being reflected by the size of the firm. So like in it, I'm thinking of a standard model here. If there's an increase in demand for an industry's product, you should see more firms, right? Lower markups, and you should see smaller firms, not larger firms.
Yeah, so we're going to think about that. If you can hold on and
Okay.
ask me again if it's not clear, but we're going to think about that, and that's actually how we're thinking. We don't have a good data to look in detail at year-to-year entry, but we use it to think about the bias of the OLS in our model. Yeah.
Thanks.
One quick question, Martina. Some of these countries are big. You may have said this, but where you said what the cement price is about, but where is the cement price in the data? That is, and how much would that affect any of the data across countries?
So the ICP aims to get a national price. So they have some data on which markets, on how many rural or urban markets they collected these microdata for, but we don't have any other information. I mean, you're right. When you look at, and this is again descriptive evidence, you can see that, for example, cement producers might charge lower prices next to their production site compared to far away where they compete with other firms. So for example, in Tanzania, you see the cement is 600 kilometers from your production site is cheaper than it is at your site. So there are definitely these strategic considerations. So we're not going to capture this in the prices and the average prices. We can capture it in the market structure variables when we consider geography.
But then it seems like there's a mechanical thing that having one plant means that I'm sending cement to a lot longer distances in a given country than having multiple plants. There's not a way to get a price at the at the plant itself.
A factory gate, yeah. So that would be ideal. We don't have that. Yeah.
There was one question from Marcel, although just a follow-up to Chris's point was you do know how many plants are inside each country as opposed to how many firms, right? So maybe you could get some traction from the difference between those two. There may be lots of plants, very few firms. That's going to help answer Chris's question. Marcel?
Yeah, there was a question by on entry, but so I thought I'd segue with a question about mergers and acquisition. You mentioned LafargeHolcim, but that's a result of a series of mergers and acquisitions to make just a gigantic firm.
Yeah. And that's definitely a trend that took place over that sample period. Yeah.
So if there aren't any more questions, why don't you keep on going?
Okay, great, excellent, thanks a lot. Okay, so we write down a very simple model of oligopoly for the production of cement in the paper, and look at the strategic production decisions while allowing for free entry with an exogenous entry cost. And that's similar to Becker's and François and Mellett's. So we use this model mainly to look at the role of market structure in generating this cross-country price dispersion. Our main assumptions are Cournot competition, constant marginal costs, although we can, in the paper, we talk a lot more about fixed costs, and we have an entry cost that I'll talk about here. We don't have dynamics here, basically because we don't have great data on that. And I was saying no spatial price differences. So that's the basic model setup, is that cement firms maximize profits in Cournot competition, subject to constant marginal costs. When we sum, these firms maximize their profits, we then sum across all firms, so we can express prices as this markup over marginal, or because we have constant marginal costs, average costs here. And epsilon is the price elasticity of demand. Now, this gives log prices as a function of markup. So log P here is a function of the markup plus the log of this average cost measure. Firms have identical production technologies, and they use inputs xk at price rk and have this Hicks neutral productivity here, where Zi is their idiosyncratic productivity. We take a first order approximation of this equation here around a benchmark number of firms and input prices, and we can get this estimating equation here, where prices are a function of the number of firms, the different prices of inputs, and eta here is the unobserved component of average productivity, and epsilon is the mean zero error term. Now, the way we think about entry is that there is a number of firms enter the market as long as the discounted value of their future profits is greater than the entry costs. There are NE firms entering the market, and they learn about their idiosyncratic cost level upon entry and produce if prices are higher than their costs. And so if xi is a random variable, that's equal to 1 if prices are larger than costs, with probability g of p and 0. Otherwise, this implies that n is equal to this x bar times ne. So this is characterizing entry. So we show in the model that if we assume xi is observed with certainty, the OLS estimates of the parameter delta exhibit bias towards 0. So higher prices incentivize entry. So we're going to downward, the OLS estimate of delta is going to be biased towards 0. We're going to underestimate the effect of the number of firms. And we basically use this to motivate our IV strategy and discipline our instrument. So what we need is that the covariance between entry costs and the unobserved productivity is equal to 0. And what we're going to use here is the cost of obtaining a construction permit. So in the empirical model, what we're going to include are baseline cost controls for scale. So log of GDP, log of area in square kilometers, and log of population, that's sort of a measure for scale. And our instrument for entry costs are costs to obtain a construction permit. So this should be something that is exogenous. This is an industry, it's not specific to the cement sector, it's just a country variable. Now, the further concerns are positive cost shocks affecting all firms. And so we try to control as best as we can for different types of shocks. So we control for institutional environment using rule of law, corruption, and instability measures from board governance indicators. And we control as much as we can for the cost of input. So the cost of fuel, electricity, those two are provided in the ICP. And then coal we get from Comtrade data. So these are prices from trade data, and machinery we get as well from Comtrade. So here we're using machinery that's used in cement production, and we try to get a price per kilogram of that machinery as an average kind of measure for the cost of imported machinery in that specific sector. I'm going to show you estimate and pooled OLS and IV specifications here. So this is our OLS. So this is the regressing the price of cement on the number of firms, log number of firms, and we include time fixed effects. We always include our scale controls, and we gradually add governance controls, and for example, here the price of fuel. You can see that our observations are becoming a bit smaller because these are not available for all of the countries. But what you can see here is that there's strong negative relationship. Countries where there is a higher number of firms have a lower price of cement. Now the IV is larger in magnitude, so the OLS is indeed biased towards 0, and we would be underestimating the effect of competition on prices. And the F-stat is around 10 here, as you can see. So we do a bunch of robustness tests. We don't, this is done on a small sample of countries or small set of observations, but it's very robust to different measures that we're using. So we've also used the number of firms per 10 million people, for example. We can use the inverse instead of the log number of firms. So it's just a different approximation of our main estimating equation. We've used the Herfindahl-Hirschman index as well instead of the number of firms to measure concentration. We've geocoded the location of all plants and then computed the number of firms within a 300-kilometer radius. And we can do this within a country, so basically assuming cement is not traded. And we can also do this assuming free trade. So then we just remove boundaries and we let firms compete with each other across borders as well. And the results are very consistent in both cases. This is to capture the fact that we might have very large countries with very dispersed firms that act as local monopolies, and we wouldn't see that when we get a variable that's a number of firms per country. We've also added further controls for the additional inputs, and then whether a country is a limestone importer. So limestone is a key ingredient that you need to produce cement, so do they need to import that? And the results are very consistent across all of these specifications. Now, there's sort of two questions that are kind of on people's minds probably, which relates to minimum efficient scale. So are these plants operating at a scale below efficiency? Thinking of small countries that might just have a very small plants. And then the second, that's sort of an interpretation, is what are these markups used to? Are we just do firms in that industry need markups to cover their high fixed costs? So this shows you the distribution here of integrated plants. So these are plants that take limestone basically and produce cement. We have a small set of plants in our sample that are grinding plants. These are the plants that would use clinker, grind clinker, and then put it into cement. From a consumer perspective, I don't really care whether that plant made it from scratch or ground the clinker. I can't grind clinker at home, so this is, it doesn't matter so much. But when we think about capacity, we'd want to compare within these two groups. And you can see these are the this distribution of capacity in different areas, and it doesn't look that distribution is substantially different across different regions. To say here that less than 3% of firms have capacity over 5 million tons per year. So this measures capacity per year in million tons that I'm not showing here, but this is very rare. I think the countervailing force here is that it's very expensive to transport cement. That's partially why it's a non-tradable good. Also, it's a hydraulic binder, so it doesn't react too well with humidity. So that kind of also limits the capacity, or it bounds it from above. So when we look even at average capacity or across space, so this is grinding capacity, and here we have integrated plants capacity. So this is the log number of firms, and on the vertical axis, it's the average plant capacity per country. You don't see that countries here with a large number of firms, so think about India, the US, that these firms are just scaling up and really able to produce at much lower costs. They don't look like the average capacity is much higher in these contexts. Okay, so this is sort of suggesting that it's not an issue of scale, that these firms are not achieving a sufficient scale. Now, our markups used to pay for fixed costs. So one way we try to get at this is using the financial accounts data from WorldScope. So we've gotten data on all firms operating in the cement industry between 2010 and 2020. And the way we look at markups is we rely on a user cost approach to measuring markups and profits. That's similar to Gutierrez and Philippon. So we define a profit margin here as 1 minus, this is the user cost of capital times capital. Here, this is the cost of goods sold, and F is the expenditure and overhead costs. And so this is the profit share of revenue that I'm showing you here. We have everything in the WorldScope data apart from the RIT here, the user cost of capital. We use 3 different measures. One is a firm-specific user cost of capital, where we take all their interest payments divided by their debts. We also get a country-specific user cost of capital when we average across firms to account for the fact that firms might be in different parts of their borrowing cycle, it's basically an average user cost of capital for these firms in a specific country. And as a third measure, we take the risk-free rate and we add 12% to account for risk and depreciation. So that's also a country-specific user cost of capital. We try to use different ways to see whether that really affects our results. It doesn't really, it shifts the capital share up and down, but it doesn't really affect our results. Okay, so this is what the shares look like. So this is the share, I'm showing you these now as shares of value added just for expositional simplicity. And you can see labor, capital, overheads, and profits. So profits are a significant share here of value added. And so it doesn't look like this is an industry where fixed costs don't leave any space for profits anymore. We can look at selected firms as well. So profit rates, for example, here we have Dangote in Nigeria that started in 2010 with a profit rate that was close to 60%. It's decreasing, coming down since then, but it's still at a fairly high level. This is for South Africa here. And so there's substantial profits to be made in this industry. We've also, I should mention that we've also estimated markups using a production function approach. We get much higher values of markups then. So we're showing these as they're more conservative measures. Now, to recap, so what we see is that market power leads to a higher price of cement, we don't see evidence that overall plant size is substantially different. Our accounting data suggests that firms make profits after paying for fixed costs. And so what we do in this final part of the paper is to ask what is the wider effect on capital. And so to quantify our results, we embed our market structure in a neoclassical model where there are end sectors. And what we do is we think about investment and consumption as distinct final goods. So we can't buy investment goods in a retail store. Cement is assumed to be only used in the construction sector, and that's part of investment. And so it combines this old two-sector idea with this recent macro misallocation literature. And we use this model to quantify the sensitivity of the steady-state capital stock to changes in markup. So we're not going to explain differences in income levels. We're going to look at how sensitive the capital stock is to changes in markups and whether there is interesting heterogeneity there. So firms use capital K, labor L, and intermediate Z. They have this production function, they produce investment goods, YI, with these three inputs. Standard preferences yield this Euler equation, and we're going to look at the steady state when D log RK is equal to D log P. So what we're going to do is approximate the impact on the steady state capital stock with this equation here. And what we have here is 1/1 minus alpha I, where this is the capital share in investment. This is a Doma weight, cement's Doma weight in investment, and this is a change in the markup. So this is the first order effect, and then this is the direct, so the first order direct effect, and then this is the reallocation effect, where these first three terms here capture the change in cement's weight in investment when markups change. What we're going to use as parameters is for lambda IC, we're going to use ICP expenditure shares. And then for consumption, we use data from the Global Cement Report. We use, for alpha I, we use 0.33. We've also used other measures, values from the literature for capital share in construction and capital share in machinery and equipment, and we use the weights that are coming out of the ICP data. The patterns are very robust to using different values. You can see that this will just scale up or down the impacts change in alpha I. For the elasticity of substitution, we use baseline estimates from Ryan, who looks at the cement industry, and we're going to conduct two counterfactual experiments. One is an entry of a single firm, and the second is a 10% decrease in markups. And that's basically the summary of what these counterfactual experiments look like. So this is the change in the steady state capital stock. These are the three elasticities that we look at. The top table shows you the percentage change from an entry of one firm, and the bottom table, a 10% decrease in markups. I'm going to show you these experiments for markets where there is at least one, where more than one firms. When we include all the monopoly markets, the impacts are larger because of this nonlinearity of the distortion. But yeah, this is given that our model is really about an oligopoly. This is what I'm showing you here. We have in the paper, we include all the firms. So you can see that the mean impacts here are small, and we wouldn't expect changes. An entry of one firm to have a large effect on the steady state capital stock. But the maximum impacts here are, for some countries, are sizable. And similarly for a 10% decrease in markups as well. So this is, in a way, this is the direct pass-through, whereas if we change, we take into account the entry of one firm that affects mass markups first through the country's market structure, and then through the change in prices. So you can see here that most countries have small effects, but the effects are sizable for certain countries. So just looking a little bit in more detail, who are these countries with large effects? You can see again, these are often African countries where we have larger percentage changes in the steady state capital stock for an entry of one firm. And these are the countries, the reason for the fact that we see these large changes there is one is that these are countries with a very concentrated market, so a small number of firms, so an entry leads to a large effect. And the second is that the expenditure share of cement in construction expenditures is sizable. So these are the two drivers of these larger effects. And these are the effects for a 10% decrease in markups. And so while 10% might look large as a counterfactual experiment for a price change, if you think back at the price differences that we observe in the data, it's actually not so large as a counterfactual experiment, I think. And again, a lot of the countries where these effects are big are African countries. The results are very similar when we look at different values for the elasticity of substitution. So we've done this with a smaller value, this is the baseline estimate that comes out of Ryan. We've done it with a smaller value, we've done it with a larger value. If the value is below 1, we can see that increases in markups are amplified and decreases are dampened through the second order effect. So this is when we think about when we treat it as a complementary good. Okay, so as a final piece, what we've assumed so far is that there is a pass-through of cement to building costs. So this matters for capital to some extent, but I haven't really shown you that that's the case. So what we try in this final bit here is to see whether we can measure the fact that this actually matters for construction costs. And it's very difficult actually from a measurement perspective to get a price for comparable building across space. Building costs are very different. The building codes are different, building materials are different, and it's actually very contracting wise, these infrastructure projects are complicated, so it's not easy to get a place where we could actually collect all of these costs. So we do this in two ways. One is using the ICP data. So the ICP, before moving to an input-based approach, we're using a basket of construction components. And so we obtained here the microdata for 2005. So this is the basket of construction components. And we've selected here components that use cement, up from the exterior sidewalk down to cement plaster on an interior wall, and regressed the price of cement on these construction components to see whether these costs are higher when cement costs are higher. As a sort of an imperfect, somewhat ad hoc placebo, we also look at unskilled labor, skilled labor, a vibratory plate compactor, and an aggregate base. So these should not matter. And we can see that they don't matter. So it's an imperfect measure, or it's really suggestive evidence, because we can get this for the 16 or 13 ring countries that the ICP uses to link the PPPs across regions. But it does show suggestive evidence. We see this when we run a regression. Here, these are the components that use cement. These are the non-cement components. Mind you, this uses 10 countries, and here we have 14 countries. We can use the 2011 ICP cement prices as well, so we get a bit more observations here, but it's a small number of observations. A second way we can do this is look at cost per square meter. And so here we use costs from, these are leading consulting firms working in construction, and we look at different building costs, and they all correlate with cement. Here we can use country fixed effects. We can control for other costs, building type fixed effects, because we have I think 10 different types of building costs in 26 locations. So here we're able to do a little bit more. Okay, to wrap up, what we find in this paper is that there's a large price dispersion of key intermediate inputs, and these are masked in aggregate price indices. To study price differences in cement, we put together this database, a market structure, location of firms' prices, and financial accounts at a global level. We use a simple oligopoly model to quantify the effect of markup on prices. We see in the data that it's unlikely due to lack of scale. Firms' financial accounts show substantial profits after covering fixed costs. And what the quantification exercise shows is that the long-run capital stock in the poorest countries seems to be most sensitive, disproportionately sensitive to bottlenecks and these distortions in an essential sector like cement. Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Just raise your hand.
I should keep this in case we need it.
Marcel, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on my earlier question about Lafarge-Holcim. I was keeping that train of thought in my mind. So what's interesting is that so Holcim was, I think, initially in Switzerland, Lafarge is in France. So then I saw on your graph, Lafarge-Holcim had a kind of a 20% profit rate, except for 1 year when they were absorbing Lafarge. So to me so it seems to me that it talks to one of your pieces of analysis, which is to look at the read. So it's a non-tradable, which basically means it cannot be transported over large distances. Because if it was about as they getting bigger across countries, they get more market power across countries. But of course, if they cannot move it, they're not physically moving cement across countries. They're just basically acquiring a big chunk of the French market when they get Lafarge. But if Lafarge was making 20% in France, they just basically make 20% on a larger value-added basis, but they don't increase their profit margin. So to me, it's a kind of since you have data on the firms, so basically these multinationals that operate across countries, and if you see, you could basically use that to confirm this intuition that basically it's not market power. Market power is not driven by the size of the firm itself. It's driven by the footprint they have in a particular location.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. There's this whole area of what you're alluding to, multi-market contact, that we're not looking at yet here in strategic pricing, and yeah.
No, my method is very simple. It's just basically confirming your intuition that it's basically driven by the fact that cement doesn't travel. So you can acquire a dominant position in other countries, but it doesn't give you more a dominant position overall. It's an interesting insight.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I know you're trying to strengthen the paper. I guess if I was going to weaken that point, I would say that if the same players are active in multiple markets, then being larger and present in more markets might affect prices. But thanks for that thought. Yeah.
I guess I have a question while we're waiting. I guess I was a bit surprised at the beginning you didn't speak, I guess, more broadly about the fact that we think maybe concrete isn't an exception, but maybe the rule that many of these inputs are extremely uncompetitive in developing countries. And I wonder, I guess, you're focusing on concrete just because it was easier to compare the qualities, or you think that the I guess it's a key input, obviously, but do you think that it's less competitive than other inputs in developing countries?
So we focus on cement here because, one, it's a really essential input, and it sort of has implications for all. If you think about households and constructed floors and health environments of households, if you think of any building for a firm, so it's a really essential input. We started in an agnostic way, looking at the price differences. And so that was one reason that we identified it as one of the key inputs. A second reason we focus on it is the non-tradable nature. And as you say, the homogeneity of the quality makes it also a valuable good to study as an example here. Having said this, looking at the price differences, I think many of the other ones warrant as well explorations of why they exist, especially the ones that are actually tradable goods. So why the price differences here are so large, I think would be great to understand better.
Can I ask a question? Hi, Martina.
Hi.
I wanted to ask, I don't know if it is relevant for your sample or time period, but the cement has been a sector that traditionally had lots of cartels in Germany and in other countries. So I don't know if this is relevant for you. Certainly the model that you use of oligopoly wouldn't be the relevant one if there was a cartel going on.
Yeah, this is relevant. I mean, markets, countries keep discovering these cartels. If we were to pick one at a global level, I think I would still pick an oligopoly model as the one that would be capturing more of the markets. But we should at least think a bit more about the different model and the implications of that. Yeah, I don't know, Keelan, do you want to jump in here? I think we've discussed this at the onset when we were deciding, and yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there's some work done on cartels for more where we would have richer data. I suppose the advantage of oligopoly is that we can just apply it uniformly across countries, and also with cartels, the anti-competitive nature would be only increased, you know. So we're kind of showing that markups play a role. So with cartels, that would only be enhanced.
Can I ask about the nature of the quantitative exercise? Did you use all the price variation and attribute that to markups, or only the amount of price variation that projected on the number of firms, or what?
We're using actually only the number of firms here. So we're not using the variation in prices. Yeah, so we use the oligopoly model to get the changes in markups, the first and second order changes, yeah.
Got it.
This is why we have the large effects for monopolies. Yeah.
Great. Are there any more questions? I guess we have time for one more question. Dave, did you want to do a quick goodbye to everyone?
Yeah, well, I should, because the most important thing we need to say is a thank you again to all the presenters, obviously, all the organizers, to Stanford, to the King Center for their financial support, and most importantly to Leslie Murray, who's been doing all the behind the scenes conference organizing this year, as well as in years past. So she's now got two streams of expertise, both organizing both offline events and online events, and she's had to learn that on the fly, obviously, and we're all very grateful for that. So I think that's everything. Thank you everyone for coming, very grateful. And yeah, these presentations will be online, and so you can also see them again and send them to your friends and spread the word, and we look forward to seeing you in person again next year.
Thanks to you as well, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for a great conference.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks, Martina.